Sandy, when you're ready.
Ready. Go.
Thank you, Sandy. Welcome back, everyone, to the ninth session in our spring series of Interfaith Explorations hosted by the Interfaith Center. My name is Sophia Said. I'm your host and the Executive Director of the Interfaith Center, the sponsor for these class series. Peace, salam, and shalom to all of you. The goal of these explorations, as you all know, is to enhance our spiritual literacy by learning about specific spiritual practices and activities that we can do in our daily life to deepen our relationship with ourselves, with the sacred all around us, and with the divine. Our classes are sponsored by Cobb Institute, by Process and Faith, and also by Spirituality and Practice website, which is also a resource for these sessions. And I am doing a much shorter introduction today because you already all know that. With that, let's bring Jay on the screen and introduce the two letters of the today. As always, we record these classes, we put them on YouTube because a lot of the folks go to the YouTube channel and listen to these sessions there. So please keep yourself muted for the recording. Jay, we are covering L for listening and P for peace today. So what letter are you going to start with today?
We're going to start with peace and turn to listening.
Oh, you're starting with peace. So I'll share one thing with all of you before we start. So when we were discussing what letters to do next week, I was actually not in favor of doing peace because because it's something that I'm always talking about, peace across faiths, peace across communities, peace in the world. It seems to me last 20 years of my life have been devoted to peace talks, peace discussions, peace activism. And I was like, Jay, let's just not do that. It's at least, I mean, it's boring to me. But then I started thinking about it later on that why is it boring? It's not boring to me. It's just maybe a very overused word and value in my life. And I just don't want to deal with it in this class. And then when I started reflecting, I picked up my book, which I do every time before this class comes, and I read this story. And it's by Parker Palmer. And he goes that I remember talking with a friend who has worked for many years at the Catholic Charities as a Catholic worker, which is, you all know, a ministry to the poor people in most of the states in America. So daily, my friend tries to respond to a wave of human misery that are as ceaseless as surf in that community. Out of my deep not knowing, I asked her how she should keep going and keep doing a work that never showed any results, a work in which problems keep getting worse all the time instead of getting better. I'll never forget her enigmatic response. And she said, the thing you don't understand, Parker, is that just because something is impossible doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Just because something is impossible doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And that's when I realized that I didn't want to do this letter because at times peace seems impossible. We keep on working on it for weeks, months, decades, and we don't make a bump. At least it seems like that. So that was my reason, Jay, to say, let's not do P for peace. But then I changed my mind after reading this story. So you have all the freedom to go ahead and do peace for today.
Well, we have a little problem here because I felt the same way as Sophia. And I have a friend who taught political science with me, a good friend. His name was Ian King. And he was British. And he used to watch Monty Python. And I didn't get to know Monty Python, but Ian did. And Ian had a great sense of humor. And so we were talking one day, and he told me about a Monty Python episode where one of the comedians said to the other, peace, peace. It's so boring. And Ian laughed, and I laughed because I knew what they meant. That if you're thinking in terms of vitality and adventure and healthy sensuality and creative tension, some tensions are good. tensions can be good, that peace can sound kind of boring. Too much equanimity, not enough zest. So I got that. So when I got, and yeah, like you, I bet, I need something like peace of heart. I certainly do. And I want somewhere in the depths of my heart to have a kind of peace. And also, like you, I'm overwhelmed with violence everywhere in our society, in our media, on television. And I'm overwhelmed with the glorification of violence. So I had to kind of question myself, hey, Jay, kind of get over this. There's something very important about peace. So that's the context in which I'm going to just identify some questions that we can talk about. Let's begin with the idea that peace is not simply the absence of violence, but it's the fullness of life. And I think if we don't begin with that idea, we won't get anywhere. So peace is not simply the absence of violence. It's also the fullness of life. And I have always understood that the word shalom had meant something like that. So early on, when I was talking about peace and learning about peace, I had many people that would say what I just said to you. And they said, now that's the genuine meaning of shalom. And I thought maybe it's the genuine meaning of salam as well. I just don't know, but I get it. And let's also remember that the fullness of life is always in relationship. It's pretty hard to have anything like a fullness of life just in your own solitariness. It's in your relationships with friends and family members and people you meet on the street and strangers, people you see on television. If you have a few political opponents, people you don't like politically, it has to do with your relationships with them too. So let's say fullness is always fullness in relationship. So if that's what we mean by peace, it's somehow the fullness of life as well as the absence of violence in relationship with others, then here are some questions that we can talk about. The first deals with inner peace, peace inside your heart. And sometimes when you will read about inner peace, people will use the Buddhist word equanimity, which means being inwardly composed. And for my part, I think equanimity is a great thing a lot of the time. But I want to ask, is there also a place or a context in life for the absence of equanimity, for discomfort? And can that too, is that part of peace or the enemy of peace? So I think about when people talk about being morally outraged at something, morally outraged. I happen to be reading a novel on the Holocaust right now, about 3 sisters in Auschwitz. Am I supposed to feel peace? And if so, what does that mean? Am I supposed to feel equanimity? And if so, what does that mean? So kind of the first general question is, inner peace really now, is it always a good thing, or can it be defined to include discomfort? Okay, you got that question? Here's another one. Is God at peace? Is God peaceful? Now, everybody here has a different understanding of what God, that word means. And for some people, it means a personal presence that you can pray to and hears prayers and cares. That's a personal God. For some people, it means something more like a force or something not so personal. The ground of being, the source of all energy, or something like that. But whatever your definition, is God, as you understand God, at peace? And let us recognize that the God presented in the biblical traditions, in the Hebrew Bible, and also in the New Testament, is not always at peace, is often in mourning and angry, and not so full of equilibrium. And if you're Christian, let's also recognize that Rabbi Jesus, he doesn't come across as always cool, calm, and collected. Take a look at Jesus as presented in Mark and Matthew and Luke. Don't go to John. Go to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a human Jesus who's filled with every emotion, sometimes peaceful, but sometimes not. But back to God. How close is peace to God and God to peace? And here's a third question. What does a culture of peace look like? If you're in a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a sangha, a bowling club, doesn't matter, civics club, garden club, book club, what would it look like for the community itself to embody a culture of peace? What's it look like? It is the community that means the most to you. Is it a culture of peace? What's that like? And one last question. When you read literature on violence, you know that violence can be intoxicating. Violence can be very, very attractive because the adrenaline's up. And so if you meet people that have been in the service and gone to war and been in the thrill of battle, they call it the thrill of battle. It's terrible. It's horrible, but the adrenaline's up and it's intense. And they will sometimes say, it was the best time of my life. There was camaraderie. There was a clear-cut enemy. You had power. And sometimes you killed some things, some people. But boy, was it intense. And it's not just in war. It can be in society at large. Look at video games. Look at the video games that our kids sometimes watch. It's about conquest, killing things, beating enemies, etc. Now, I don't want to critique that. I don't want to say, oh, isn't that too bad? That's not my point. My question is, can peace be as exciting as intoxicating, as attractive as, unfortunately, violence often is. So, do any of those questions, can any of those questions be springboards for your own reflections or things you'd like to add to the hopper? Or please do so. Alan.
Well, I just wanted to talk a little bit about something that has really caused a lot of contemplation for me regarding peace, and perhaps it will others as well. But MLK was such an amazing person, and really smart, really advocated nonviolence, and yet at the end of his life, in the Red Summer, just before he was shot, he talked about that sometimes violence leaks out. Now, he wasn't advocating for violence, but he was suggesting that, if people are treated in a certain way for too long a period of time, that sometimes violence is inevitable. And it just causes me great contemplation about such an advocate of peace, and yet at the end of his life really saying, what's going on here, and maybe sometimes peace doesn't solve everything. And so I just wanted to add that. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. That was Malcolm X's critique of Martin Luther King Jr. The Black Power movement. Sometimes violence is necessary. So it's a huge question. Anybody else? We're just kind of in the general terrain of peace and its implications. Anybody else have something they want to put on the table?
Doesn't the Bible say the same thing, basically, that sometimes violence is necessary to achieve the goal? So I think God in the Torah, at least, that's some of the objection that I hear, is that it's such a violent book, and that God is directing this violence. And we always say, well, it's for the greater good. And so these enemies had to be vanquished in order for this to happen, or the people to get to the land, or whatever that is. But it's been troubling to many Jews, and that's one of the things that I look at too, which is when I listen to Torah discussions, and when it's so I have in my mind a difficulty whether this is God's word or this is word that comes through man. So when it's explained to me that this was a time in history, and this is what was going on in history, and God is taken out of it, it brings me more peace to think that God was, was taken out of it. But yet I walk that fine line, because I also believe that this is divinely inspired. And so it's troubling to me. It doesn't give me peace of mind. And I'm hoping before I go from this world that I'll have some measure of understanding about that. But I want to also interject that in Israel, when 18-year-olds are inducted into the IDF, they go to different places. Sometimes it's at Latrun, where there have been numerous battles. Sometimes it's at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, where the temple once was. And it can happen in a variety of different landmark places in the land of Israel, but always the inductees, I thought I had a book here next to me, is given a small Bible, and they're sworn on that Bible for several purposes. One is to understand the history of what it is that they're doing, and that they are being inducted to protect the land of Israel, which was given to us 3,000 years ago, and that belief. And also to say, you are a moral It's not portrayed in the news this way, but you are a moral agency of the land of Israel, and never forget the fact that you have responsibilities in terms of how to treat your enemy, how to treat other people, how not to take advantage of your status as a protector or a soldier, whatever it is. And every once in a while, they go back to that where they're holding the Bible in their hands and saying, like when they review what had happened, it goes back to this. This holds the 10 Commandments. This holds our law, and you need to be abiding by that law. I'm not saying everybody does, but that's basically what the standard is, which is supposed to bring a form of peace, not only to them as soldiers, but to everyone around them, that they're doing this as morally as they possibly can. Again, not everybody does it, but that's the standard.
Ellen, there's several very important issues in what you just said. And I don't want to take up the time of others right now, but I do want to speak to them before we close the peace discussion, which I will. So I want to see if anybody else has anything to say, but I would like to respond to.
Hey,
Jerry.
Jay, this is Jerry. For the last 7 years, I've been very connected to a Syrian group. I serve on the board of the organization. And in general, in an area where you have war going on, peace is the absence of war. Now, you know, that covers a lot. But when you are at war or in a war, you have no real priorities or ability to set priorities outside of kind of arbitrary demands that come on you. And so you as a person, you as a community are really defined externally. So, you know, when the noise stops and there is peace in some form, it takes a while for those people to recover their identity. And so it's hard to explain, but it is a definition of peace.
Yes, yes. Well, Jerry, I just want to say amen. Amen to that. On all fronts, no qualifications. Let that be what peace means too. Anybody else want to put an idea into the hopper or a thought?
Jay, I'm listening to all of this and coming back to what you talked about, tensions in the beginning. I think it's important to understand what is peace to us, because for some people, peace could be, or like Jerry said, in a place of war, peace could be just the absence of violence or absence of destruction. Yeah. But is peace only absence of violence, which means, are we saying that peace is synonymous with non-violence? Which in my definition, firstly, I don't have a clear definition of peace, but whatever it is, peace is not synonymous with just non-violence. For me, peace is a lot more than that. Peace is creating those internal and external conditions in which people can live freely and they can grow to their maximum potential, which means peace is more synonymous with justice than nonviolence. And in order to have a just society, a free society, then you need strong conditions, strong rules and regulations. So anyways, I just want to put it out there that Do we think peace is more synonymous with nonviolence or justice? Is justice a requirement to or a prerequisite to have peace in a society? And lastly, I would say that for me personally, and for many of us, peace comes from within. And it reminds me of a quote from Buddha, Gautama Buddha, who said that peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. Which takes me to that terrain that, if you're trying to make peace within, then we have to deal with tensions. Or if you're trying to make peace without, then we have to work with our opponents, with our enemies, with the people who do not agree with us, and we have to make them our partners. So we cannot have peace unless we're willing to work through those tensions. So just a few more thoughts to put out there.
Well, who would have thought that a letter that neither Sophia or I wanted to deal with would bring forth so many important ideas, which it has. I'll say a little bit, this is in response to Ellen, unless somebody else really wants to put an idea out there. I'm happy for someone to do that. Anybody want to? Then here goes. Ellen, often God is pictured in Torah and also in aspects of the New Testament as a holy warrior, battling against evil, battling for good, but a holy warrior. And critics of that say that that is a serious problem. It is rendering unto God, or imagining God on the analogy, not simply of a political ruler, but a military ruler. And that imagery is thoroughly biblical in many respects. It's not the only image, but it is there and should not be hidden from. And so then people can ask the question, is that really God, or is that people imagining God? And can the texts themselves contain not only the truth, but also human projection? And many, many Christians would say it also contains projection. I myself went to seminary and took courses in biblical studies. I learned that. So I'm a typical mainline Protestant Christian, Methodist. But actually many Catholics would say that too. So there is, and also many Reformed Jews would say that too. So part of Reformed Judaism and Protestant Christianity and certain sections of Catholic Christianity recognize that Holy Scripture, so to speak, is not without its errors. It's not without its projections. Jesus is famous for having said, render unto God that which belongs to God, and render unto Caesar that which belongs to Caesar. But don't confuse the two. And process theology says, unfortunately, we have rendered unto God that which belongs to Caesar. So that image is in our imaginations. I want to give a but, though, now. One of the wisest rabbis I know, writers, is Abraham Heschel. And Heschel wrote a beautiful book on the Psalms, wrote a lot of books. And he knew that his readers would say, well, shouldn't we eliminate from the Bible and from the Psalms, all images of divine wrath. And Heschel said, please don't do that. Please understand that wrath is to be understood symbolically, not literally, but it's the flip side of divine pain. Wrath is a biblical way of talking about divine pain and how much even God is hurt by violence, by evil. So for my part, when I hear images of holy warrior, I don't just give a thumbs down. I say there's some wisdom there too in Abraham Heschel's sense. It's a way of thinking about divine pain and having a relational God.
Thank you for that, Jay. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but thank you for that, because that is, I didn't know that about Rabbi Heschel writing, and all of what you say is very important to me. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Jay, I've always had a twin singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers."
Yeah.
I don't know. It sounds a little more militant than I was.
Jerry, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. If you want to be religious in our time, we have to learn to live with ambiguity. We just have to learn to say our images, our ideas are not one thing. They're mixed bags. Their gifts or their sins. It's everywhere. About just the last word about war per se. I don't see very much in Hebrew Bible, and Ellen, I'm happy to be corrected on anything I say, but I don't think the theme of radical nonviolence, loving your enemy, I don't see that in Torah. I see treating your enemies with respect and warfare. I see that in the Quran as well. But I don't hear this. I don't hear an injunction against the use of military force in some circumstances. I don't hear it. And so we can even ask ourselves, well, where in the world did that one come from then? For good or ill, I think it came from Jesus, the ministry of Jesus. So he seems to have been a rabbi. I know he was Jewish, who was smitten with the idea that we could love our enemies. And a lot of people read that as involving a commitment to radical nonviolence. But for many people, certainly including Christians, that doesn't make any sense. There's a time when violence is needed. So there's a whole tradition in historical Christianity about when is war justified and when is it not.
Yes.
That, like everything else, is a matter of interpretation, discussion, and ambiguity. So I'm not going to solve that one, but just to say that's the way it looks to me. You can't turn Torah into Gandhi. Might like to, but you can't do it. Don't do it. Be honest.
Thank you.
All right. You want to go to listening? Let's do. Let's put up what they say about listening. Can I share the screen?
You should.
Yes, you can.
Now, I think that you all know me well enough to know I'm going to make a mistake the first time around, and it's going to be the wrong document. Yep. Wouldn't you know it? I will never master this. So I'm going to give up on that one too. I'll just tell you the questions. First thing, let's just note the power of listening in life. And in my experience, a lot of times when people hurt, they don't want to be fixed. They want to be listened to. And a lot of people that have the fixing impulse, immediately they want to turn into a problem to be solved. And sometimes, of course, that's a good thing. But people hunger just to be listened to. And especially in situations that are unfixable, that's the deepest of needs. But it's actually a need for everybody, not just people in the catastrophic situations. You want to be understood. You want to be heard. You want to be listened to. I want to be heard. I want to be listened to. So love, whatever it is more than overt action. Love is deep listening. And doesn't have to solve anything. It's in the listening itself. So one way to think about God, for me at least, is as the deep listening. Is there something in the universe that feels the feelings of each and all in an empathic, non-judgmental way, and is the deep listening? A lot of times when people talk about God, they want to say, what does God do? But let us also ask, and what does God feel? And is there something like deep listening in the very heart of God? Now, another just quote to get us started. There's a Benedictine sister whose name I just forgot. Joan Chittister. And she's got a paragraph in one of her books on the Benedictine life. And there's a sentence that appears, ours is a ministry of listening. We want to be people of the ear, except we want to listen with the ears of our hearts. Not just our physical ears, but the ears of our heart, to listen with the ear of the heart. And that phrase that comes from Benedict, Catholic monk. And then she says, what does it mean to listen with the ear of the heart? It means to pay attention, of course, but it also means to listen with a willingness to be touched. A willingness to be touched. So when you really listen, there's a vulnerability. Because you'll be touched. You'll be moved. You'll be changed. I don't have a particular question there, but does that very idea raise any thoughts for anybody here among us? And then we're going to talk about discernment next. Yeah. Anybody have any thoughts on the role of listening in human life, or want to add to what I said, or subtract, whatever?
Jay, I'll just comment that I think that we're all pretty lousy at listening. I think I fall in that category. I don't want to indict everybody, but we're so attuned to either problem solving or working on our identity that we feel like that we have to offer something. And it's interesting, I'm in a search process right now, and we're having to listen more than, and we try to set up some structure. Do not talk until everybody's talked. And, on some of the stuff, and I'm thinking like, I have a lot more to say than that. I need to interrupt somebody to clarify some confusion. And so I don't know. I don't think we're taught to listen as much as we're kind of lean in with either some authority or some seniority, or I don't know, but I just don't think that we're taught to listen. I don't know. I just think that's really an area of growth, no matter where you are in your age, that you check yourself and say, try to listen more than you talk, or try to listen a lot more than you talk. I think it's a real self-awareness issue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm into that too. Yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciate what you said about that willingness to be touched and the vulnerability that makes. I enjoy volunteering at Canvas Community with the homeless, feeding homeless, and I have found that I was holding a part of myself back from them, and I finally kind of called myself on that, and or was called on that by God, I think. And now it's the greatest pleasure simply to ask a question and then sit back and allow to hear myself to hear what they're saying. And I'm not afraid of being touched by them anymore. And it's been a real growth experience for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. I think it makes sense to everybody, certainly to me. Anybody else on willingness to be touched and listening? And one way to think of God, again, is the deep listening that always carries a willingness to be touched. And so that means there's a vulnerability in God too. And so that would be the critique of images of God as self-contained and totally autonomous and invulnerable. Not the whole story. Sandy, are you're muted, I think.
Yes, what? Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. Maybe you were waving at somebody.
I'm sorry. One of our board members walked in and I had to say hello and she left now. Okay.
Well, I think we call that doing your job.
Jay, let me remind us of two of the spiritual values or spiritual alphabet that we have covered already. And for me personally, they both really heavily rely on the quality of listening. So last week we talked about teachers, and I'm so glad we're doing listening today. And we ended the session by talking about how everything in life can be a teacher, not only our teachers, but the nature, the winds, the animals, the experiences that we have, they all can be your teacher. And that's very true. So I personally believe that for me, having teachers in my life actually less depend on the teacher and more depends on my ability to listen and to be at that. And for me, listening is a really important spiritual skill, because if I'm not at that spiritual state when I can listen, then I cannot have any teachers in my life, because everything that I'm getting from them depends on my ability to listen. So that's one thing. And the second thing we did really early on, I hope some of you remember, we did Age for Hospitality. And I have always felt that listening is a form of spiritual hospitality. Listening really creates that holy silence or a spiritual sacred space that allows us to invite strangers in our life and get closer to them and become their friends. And I say that specifically because a big part of my life, and most of you know, in interfaith work, what do? I am actually always working with strangers or people where we have barriers in between us, barriers of race, religion, culture, ethnicities, and they're different from me. But I'm working with them to be able to become friends with them. So listening is a skill that I actually learned the hard way because I'm a problem solver. I'm always moving into a situation to fix problems. But then I learned that, it's only when I'm able to listen carefully with people with my full heart and soul, when the walls of separation between human beings start crumbling down, and we can actually look at them as human beings in a sacred space and get to know them and become friends with them. So I cannot engage in the practice of interfaith peacemaking or even hospitality without first practicing active listening to people.
Mm. Those of you at Friendship Camp and Sophia and others, when you listen to children, for example, you're not only listening for their suffering, that's one thing, but you're listening for their joys. And so you ask a child or a friend, what do you love? What do you find beauty in? What makes you excited? And I find sometimes when I talk about listening, we focus so much on sharing in the condition of the other, not you, but some people focus so much on suffering, they kind of forget the joy. And I think peace comes about not only in shared suffering, but in shared joy. But to have shared joy, like, for example, when I talk with someone that's Jewish or Muslim or belongs to a different faith of mine, I want to know, what music do you hear? What is the beauty that you hear in your Judaism? What is the beauty that you find in your Islam? And as I ask, then I just want to listen and kind of be grateful. And it does not have to be my own. So another thing Joan Chittister said is you have to listen with a taste for otherness, with an appreciation of otherness, of uniqueness, of difference. And the differences can be as beautiful as any similarities, sometimes more. And I know you've had that experience, Sophia, because you've met so many people with different faiths. Don't you ever just have a feeling that's really kind of beautiful? It's not me, it's not the tradition I am in, but it's still so gorgeous.
And
So I
excellent
think,
and beautiful and brings healing. And I would add one more thing to it, Jay, which I have noticed a lot, that sometimes, and sorry to take it away from the theme that you're doing, but before I forget it, sometimes when we are listening to people and listening to them generously with open heart, especially I'm working with refugees, I felt that, I saw that, and I experienced that. They only hear the truth in themselves after we generously listen to them. And sometimes it's the first time they believe themselves too, because they're saying something, they want to share something which they themselves don't believe, or they're scared to even voice it. But when you listen to them, or I listen to them actively, generously, they believe in themselves. They find the truth in themselves. And that's such a beautiful experience. That just by your listening, just doing nothing, just sitting and listening, you can just give so much strength to that person. You can make them believe in themselves. You can help them find truth in themselves. Yeah, just wanted to put it out there. And it's very powerful, very powerful.
Ellen, I see your hand up. I want to see if anybody has a thought or a comment to add to what Sophia just said before we hear from you. Anybody want to speak to what Sophia just said? Sophia, when I first was introduced to feminism so many years ago, there were women's groups and they didn't want men included. And of course, we men were very offended by that. What do you mean you don't want me included? It was the same thing with kind of Black Power movements. You know, we don't want any white people included. What do you mean? Why? That's not what. But I think I learned a little bit, and I learned about the value of those. And there's a famous story of an early women's group led by a woman named Nell Morton. They were sitting in a circle, and they were sharing their stories of being women in their situation as women. And there was a woman sitting in the circle, and she was kind of quiet and looking down, and you know, you could tell that it was going to be her turn in the circle pretty soon. And it finally got to her, and she looked up and she started telling her story. In my marriage, sometimes I feel like a nothing, like a doormat, like a zero, she said. And as she said that, she stopped mid-sentence in one sentence, and she looked at the other woman and she said, "You are hearing me. You are hearing me into speech." And what she meant was that their listening heard her into speech. And that's what you're saying too, not only speech, but validation, confirmation, self-awareness. Alan.
There's a country, I can't remember the name, the country it is, but they've started slow checkouts at grocery stores. And so they have conversations with people, and the whole point is that it goes slow and you get to have conversations, and they've become immensely popular and they're expanding them. You know, simple listening in that is something that goes a long way. We have, I mean, in this country specifically, we have an incredible epidemic of loneliness, you know, it actually stems from colonialism, but this need to constantly be progressing or moving forward, you know, that doesn't allow for listening, you know, and we often take in our society, we kind of close off from other people we pass in everyday life. And sometimes it's sort of like indifference is the general attitude towards them. And, you know, I personally think that even if you don't say anything, having a listening stance towards somebody, you know, that could go a long way, you know, the value of community, that could go a long way in helping a lot of the difficulties that our society faces.
Well, let's start a movement called the listening movement, the Interfaith listening movement. Maybe it already exists. I think it does. Let's close this out with another question, and I'll ask you: do you feel like God, however you understand God, is inside you as an inner teacher? As a guiding presence? And if you don't, of course, that's got it. But if you do, how do you listen to that inner teacher? Is what you're taught always clear and distinct? how do you discern, how do you distinguish that voice from that voice of your own ego or social convention? So that's the question of discerning the Spirit of God as a guiding presence within the heart. Any of you have any thoughts on that, or is that language meaningful to you?
Now I have my hand up. Okay. I have taken many classes, and I've taught some classes on prayer, and how many people believe that God is like Santa Claus, where you go and you say, I want this, I want that, please be with me, do this, do that, do this. And over time, I've learned that, prayer is a two-way street. It is a relationship. As you were saying earlier about where you can go to God and unload everything on him or her, whatever the name may be. But part of that, and that's true, and I do that, part of that is learning to sit in silence and with discernment, to sit and listen. And I have found that in listening, you aren't going to hear something once. You're going to hear it over days, maybe weeks. Something's going to be put on me in that listening process, but you have to be open to it. And it is sometimes hard to distinguish between ego and what I really want and what God is telling me to do. But God, I have found, won't give up on that. Really, if you're a listener, if you really listen, you're going to hear things over and over. And that's just my experience with prayer and relation with God, is that if you're not listening and not having quiet time and pull out your discernment card, then the relationship to me can't go as far as I feel like it.
Anybody else on that? Our time's about to be up. Sandy, anybody else want to speak to that from any perspective? A question to think about for all of us is, can communities discern? Can there be community discernment, not simply individual discernment? And can a community feel the beckoning, the calling towards some kind of action, some kind of decision? Yeah. So individual discernment and community discernment, and really the role of silence in all. The communities need silence too. All right, Sophia Said, I think it's time.
Let's close this. I think this is a very good thought to close the session today. And I hope, thought and prayer and hope, that let's go away from this class in hopes to improving our own receptivity and sharpening our own ability to hear and listen, not only the people around us, but also the sacred around us, and also the sacred within us. So maybe this next week be an exercise for you all to practice that and increase and enhance that ability and receptivity. I want to actually, instead of doing the poem that I picked, I really want to talk about the next session before we close, because it's quite connected to listening. So we have one more class left. Next Wednesday is our last session. We will meet and discuss X for mystery and Z for zeal. After that class on May 24th, we are taking 2 weeks break. We won't meet on 31st and June 7th. And from June 14th, we are starting our summer session of Interfaith Explorations. And our summer session of Interfaith Explorations is an 8-week sessions on dreams and dream work. And there is a lot of listening involved, because we will be really diving deep into listening to our dreams and learning how and what can we listen through our dreams. So I just want you all to know that summer session of Interfaith Exploration starting from June 14th will be on dreams. And I will see you all next week with Sandy and Jay talking about X and Z. Until then, peace, salam, and shalom.